Hello. This is the second of 3 videos providing an introduction to the federal sentencing guidelines. Part 1 provided an overview of the United States Sentencing Commission. This second segment provides an overview of the federal sentencing guidelines. In this video, you will learn about the basic framework of the federal sentencing guidelines, their role in the sentencing of federal criminal defendants, and the 3-step sentencing process. The federal sentencing guidelines are designed to provide federal judges with fair and consistent sentencing ranges to consult at sentencing. Thus, the primary purpose of application of the federal sentencing guidelines is, ultimately, to obtain a sentencing range applicable to a particular defendant. The appropriate sentencing range for an offender can be located on the sentencing table. Let's take a look at the table now. The intersection of a particular point on the vertical axis with a particular point on the horizontal axis will provide the court with the applicable guideline range for a particular defendant. The guidelines take into account both the seriousness of the criminal conduct of the instant federal offense and the seriousness of the defendant's prior criminal record.
The number on the vertical axis provides a numeric proxy for the severity of the defendant's conduct in the instant federal offense. Based on the severity of the offense, the guidelines assign most federal crimes to one of 43 offense levels. The Roman numeral on the horizontal axis of the sentencing table provides a proxy measuring the severity of the defendant's prior criminal record. Each offender is also assigned to one of these 6 criminal history categories, based upon the extent of his or her past misconduct. The point at which the offense level and the criminal history category intersect on the Commission's sentencing table determines an offender's guideline range. In order to provide flexibility to the top of each guideline range exceeds the bottom by 6 months or 25%, whichever is greater. Judges may sentence within the appropriate guideline range as calculated, or if there is an aggravating or mitigating circumstance that would call for a sentence either above or below the otherwise applicable guideline range, the judge may sentence either above or below the guideline range that was appropriately calculated. A sentence above or below the otherwise applicable guideline range is called a departure if it is based upon a factor contained within the guidelines manual, or it is called a variance if it is based upon a factor listed at 18 U.S.C. Section 3553A.
So then, what role do the guidelines play in the sentencing of federal criminal defendants? Well, the federal sentencing guidelines are part of a 3-step approach to federal sentencing. This approach was established by the Supreme Court decision United States v. Booker. The Booker decision addressed the question of whether the 6th Amendment right to jury trial applies to the federal sentencing guidelines. In the Booker opinion, the court held that the 6th Amendment does apply to the federal sentencing guidelines. This rendered the federal sentencing guidelines to be advisory instead of mandatory. Under the approach set forth by the court, district courts, while not bound to apply the guidelines, must consult those guidelines and take them into account when sentencing, subject to review by the courts of appeal for reasonableness. As a result, the provisions set forth in 18 U.S.C. Section 3553A, after correct application of the federal sentencing guidelines, must be considered by the court in imposing a sentence, even for sentences within the guideline range, and must be used by the appellate courts in determining reasonableness.
Let's quickly review the 7 factors set forth in 18 U.S.C. Section 3553A. 1. Nature and circumstances of the offense. History and characteristics of the defendant. 2. Purposes of sentencing. Punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. 3. The kinds of sentences available. 4. The sentencing guidelines. 5. The guideline policy statements. 6. Avoiding unwarranted sentencing disparities. And 7. The need to provide restitution. The federal sentencing guidelines, therefore, are the very first step in determining an appropriate sentence for a federal criminal defendant. Step 1 of the three-step approach established by the Booker decision is correctly apply and consider the sentencing guidelines, including the guideline range and other aspects of the sentence called for by the guidelines. Step 2, consider the guidelines policy statements, including those addressing departures that might warrant consideration in imposing sentence. And finally, step 3, consider 18 U.S.C. section 3553A taken as a whole and determine if the appropriate sentence is one within the advisory guideline system, that is a sentence within the guideline range or departure, or one outside the advisory guideline system, also known as a variance. For additional information on the basic application of the federal sentencing guidelines, please watch Part 3 of the Introduction to the Federal Sentencing Guidelines videos.